to welcome four of the people who helped make this such a beautiful film. Cinematographer James Laxton, editor Joi McMillon, composer Nicholas Britell, and writer-director Barry Jenkins. Welcome, and thank you for just an exquisite film. Thank you. I did a wrap screening for Moonlight a few years ago. And I'm thinking that one you were working from an unproduced play where you pretty much...
I'm trying to get comfortable, yeah.
You pretty much had the ability you could change things. There were no stakes about, I have to remain true to the text. With this one, you're dealing with the work of one of the most significant writers of the 20th century, one of the real key chroniclers of the African American experience. I would imagine that in one way, that's a gift, but in another way, you really feel a responsibility to him and to what this means to readers.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think that, Sorrel Alvin McCraney is one of the literary gifts of the 21st century. And so I think making Moonlight was no less precious in that sense. But, I think you have to think of it in this way of they're both adaptations, but a play is a much more porous form. There's literally less words involved in a play, whereas when you're working from literature, there's so much. The text is so dense, especially James Baldwin. It's all about interiority to a certain degree. And the other thing was I could talk to Terrell. I could literally call him up, be like, I have a question about this, I have a question about that. How does this feel? But I couldn't call and commune with James Baldwin. And so, yeah, it was a very interesting experience, very challenging, I'll say honestly. Because I think the book is one thing and the film is another, and it took a process of working with these wonderful people and understanding it's not just my film, it's our film, and that James Baldwin was not here making this adaptation. And so it was an intellectual hurdle that I had to get through. But once I broke through it, we just broke down through it.
Could you ask him to turn up the volume, please?
I know, I was saying it when I was walking in, but I don't, it's right in my ear, which means it's not in your ear. So, yeah. It's up as high as it can go. See, I heard you say that back there, right?
Didn't you actually have notebooks that Baldwin had written talking about if there was going to be a movie?
Yeah, but thankfully I didn't get those. I'm going to try to project a little bit. Thankfully I didn't get those until after, it was like maybe 2 months before pre-production started in New York. So I'd already gone through multiple drafts of the script. Moonlight had already come and gone. And this package just showed up on my doorstep. I was not expecting it. And yeah, it was a notebook that Gloria Khalifa Smart, Mr. Baldwin's sister who runs his estate, she had gifted him this notebook in, I want to say 1978, because it also had, I haven't said this publicly, it had a card that she had originally written to him, and he had kept it in the notebook, and so she had written a second note to me, and sent this notebook to my address, to our office actually. And it only had 3 pages written into it, but it was Mr. Baldwin starting the screenplay for BEALE Street Could Talk. And it also had on the first page his thoughts of who he should cast, who should be the director, all these different things. And the list of directors was kind of dope. It was Louis Malle, Francois Truffaut, Gordon Parks, Lloyd Richards, and then Barry Jenkins. I mean, my name wasn't in it, but obviously I ended up making a film, and so I was like, Barry Jenkins. But what I found in it was, and I think the reason why she sent it to me was it was a confirmation that what we were doing was very much in spirit with Mr. Baldwin. He had written very clearly that it should have voiceover spoken by Tish. There were certain scenes of their childhood that he thought were wonderful in the book, but wouldn't be appropriate in the film. And we had decided to omit those scenes as well. So yeah, it was one of those things. It was almost like okay, young man, you're jumping off the cliff, and here's a little push to let you know you should jump off the cliff. And that was kind of how I took it.
Well, James and Nick, were there certain things that you took from James Baldwin's prose that helped influence you in the way the film would look or sound?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely, for sure. I would say not only this novel particularly, but also I would say just the voice of Mr. Baldwin at large was something that was very much on our minds going into pre-production. For me, it had a lot to do with what format we shot on, what lenses we shot on, how the light would play on people's faces. A lot of that had to do with how he, I think, spoke as an individual, but also in his writing as well. An example of that is the format for us was the Less 65, which is a large format camera. It has this sort of I call it almost like a bedrock of strength that I felt could only do justice to the voice of Mr. Baldwin. So I felt like to us that format had a lot to do with his writing generally.
And yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a power, and James, we were actually talking about this earlier. There's a power, and there's a very nuanced beauty in Baldwin's writing. And I think for sure there's a directness in a way too. I think with the music and with the approach that we took. But for me, so much of the journey that we all went on, but for me in particular, I think is following Barry's initial instincts. For me, I read the book, read the script, and we talked. But I always feel Barry's first feelings of where we're going to go are so impactful and so insightful. And the first things he said to me were that he was hearing brass and horns. That was the first thing. And so I started experimenting with trumpets and flugelhorns and French horns and wrote pieces of music with that, and I played them for Barry. And I think one of the things that we always feel is that we don't know what's going to work when we're trying things, and in some ways I think that's what's exciting about the process, is that we're going on this kind of journey together, and Barry is so open to experimenting and trying things out, and I'm never afraid to show things that might not work. But those early brass pieces are not in the movie because they didn't work, actually. And what we found was that they were missing this feeling of strings. And it was really for the score, it was the strings mixed with the brass for sure, but it was the strings that became this feeling of love.
So, Barry, did you have strong ideas about how you wanted it to sound, how you wanted it to look, how you wanted it put together as you were starting?
I did and I didn't. James and I, we went to film school together, so we've been working together for, I'm 39, for nearly half my life at this point. I've known this guy, I've been working with him, and so we always start from an intellectually emotional place, I like to call it. And so choosing a format, like James said, Alexa 65, and going 2x1 as opposed to 185 or 235, which for us was a mixture of medium format still portraiture and cinema. But then from there, it's all about the emotion of the main character, the point of view of the piece. And with this film, what was really interesting for me, to go back to your first question, was, is it James Baldwin's film? Is it James Baldwin's book? It's Barry Jenkins' film. And so I have to find a point of view. And Moonlight is a reflection of Chiron's consciousness, and Beale Street is a reflection of Tish's consciousness. And so both James and Nick did a really wonderful job of understanding that it wasn't for me to give them direction of where the sound should go or where the image should go. It was for Tish to give us the direction of where the sound should go or where the image should go. And so I think with both these guys, we started just with the directional. We started working down that path, and then we just chased it. And we started out, like Nick said, with an all brass score. And then this lovely thing happened where Nick was writing compositions for brass, but playing them with strings, with cellos. His wife happens to be one of the greatest cellists in the world. That's what you're always hearing when you watch these films. And then by the end, because Tish has evolved, now he's composing things for strings, but we're playing it with brass. And so the saxophones, the flugelhorn, those things start playing the melodies you hear with the strings in the beginning of the film. And same thing with James. It was this film was interesting, the color dynamics, because Moonlight looks a certain way, Beale Street looks a different way. And again, James and I did not sit down, 6 months before production and go, greens and yellows, greens and yellows. But in working out and trying to like really reach inside Tish's consciousness and understand how she felt about the things she was seeing, which is what you guys ultimately seen, it became green and gold.
And love.
And love, yes, the colors of love. Yeah.
Well, Joi, at what point do you start thinking of, are you before the shooting, are you already thinking about the editing process, or does that come later for you?
Yes, and I would say ultimately, like the way Barry writes, I think even though he says post is not his favorite part of the process, he's already
Nobody
thinking
here
about
knows that.
post.
You gotta take it, Jeff.
Well, I'm just getting it out there before you say it. And so the way he writes, the images and the sounds that he, puts into the script is kind of a blueprint for us as editors to know kind of what he's thinking about when we're putting together a scene. And so certain scenes are definitely influenced by his writing, and then other scenes we kind of go off on our own, and hopefully he likes it.
Well, I want to single out two scenes in particular that I sort of see as centerpiece scenes in the movie that are both people in rooms talking, but are very different. I mean, the first one being when the two families come together at the beginning, and you've got 8 people in a room talking over each other, and the second one being just a conversation at the table with Daniel and Fonnie. Those seem like they very, very different challenges in those two that pretty much involve all of you. Can you?
Yeah. Actually, it's kind of cool since the 4 of us have another Q&A together, and so yeah, that's an interesting thing to talk about. Because I have 2 editors. Joi did cut the scene with Brian Tyree Henry and Stephan James when the character Daniel shows up, but Nat cut the scene with the 2 families in the living room. But I just remembered as you were saying that when these scenes of people talking are happening, especially when they're really connecting, and I think when you guys are really understanding what the character's about, I don't like to have score. But I remember now, I forgot this. I remember we had that scene with the 2 families, and you kept going, I think we need score, I think we need score. And you kept trying it, and I was like, no, man, that's Al Green, bro. We need no score, we need no score.
He lets me try everything.
Exactly. But then later, like 20 minutes later in the film, when the scene with Brian Tyree Henry and Stephan James, Nick once again said, I think we need score, I think we need score. I said, no, it's Miles Davis, we don't need score. He was like, but let me try something. And when Tish and Fonnie first make love, this track Eros plays. And in Moonlight, we did a lot of chopping and screwing when you slow things down and things like that. We didn't do much of it in this film, but in this moment, Nick said, there's something about this moment that feels like some of these melodies need to come back. And so the thing that he first attempted in the scene with the 2 families, we then applied it in this space. And so the sound, the rumble in the room you hear, when Brian Tyree Henry and Stephan James are having that conversation, it's the same song that plays when they make love, or the same elements at least. And so so good on you, bro. And it's kind of cool because I think in a way, the way that sequence came together, I think all of us up here played a role. James, that was the last thing we shot in New York, and we did it. It was a 2-camera shoot for like maybe 40% of the production, and so we had 2 cameras on this day because we only had Brian for 1 day. And I love you for this because we shot that scene with 2 cameras for like 8 hours, and then we were like, you know what? I'm gonna blame myself on this. So I was like, it's working, but it's not there. And so James kicked 1 camera off the set, and that was when we put the camera on the slider and started panning back and forth to follow the energy, so we don't have to cut between the actors. We just want to follow the energy from Stephan. It evolves. Now it's Brian's. It evolves again, and then it comes back. And I remember just giving the footage to Joi and just being like, make this work. and so we all kind of like, I don't know, it was one of those things where I feel like, we don't storyboard. Only thing we storyboarded in this film was the scene with the birth, with the baby, because it was so visual effects heavy, we had to board that one. But I like how we all start with the direction, and it's not about the destination, it's just about let's go in this direction. Y'all got something to say about it? Joi?
It's a pleasure to work with you.
I will say, there was like a 20-minute version of that scene, just these two dudes talking, that I loved. But Joi is my rock, and she knew that 12 minutes was enough. 12 minutes was enough.
Well, James, what made you say, let's get rid of one of the cameras?
I think that just you know it in your gut a bit. There's something missing. There's an energy missing. There's I think what in both the scenes you're referencing, and I think in general, I think what Barry's so great at, and I think what he drives all of us to do, is this concept of immersiveness. And I don't think either of us felt like we were in that conversation yet. We hadn't got there yet. We hadn't dug deep enough. And there was some element that was missing, and I think that was that connective tissue of letting the momentum of dialogue, of performance, energy, etc., push our camera from one character to the following. And I think within that movement, within that sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, this energy that happens when you're on the set or when you're in the editing room, it's inexplainable, but it just was the thing missing. I think we recognized that at some point. And, I think something hopefully you're realizing through this conversation a little bit is how collaborative Barry is, and how there really isn't ever a wrong answer. There's mistakes, and we make them constantly, but there's never, I say this all the time, he's never told me no, and I've never told him no. And I think that's very, I would say probably that's true for all of us.
Get some 32 days. 32 days.
I'm just saying though, like it's this like pushing, telling whittling with this. It's like fine sculpting. It's like you sculpting, and then finally we fab.
And I would add to that actually that what you were talking about with immersiveness, in that scene, I think that was actually what I was instinctively feeling as well, which Barry sort of encouraged me on, was what we did to the Miles Davis Blue and Green track, which is on the record player and it stays on the record player, is I started running it through this long-tailed reverb so that it starts to feel like your sense of perception is changing, like your sense of time and space is changing. And as that starts to happen, that's when the rumbling comes in. And I think, I really took to heart something Barry talked a lot about, which was with the music, I'm not trying to tell you what to feel. I think I'm actually trying to hopefully make pieces that feel the way that we think the characters are feeling. We're trying to get into that mind space and that emotional space. And that was, all the things I think we're trying to do is how do we literally kind of bring you inside of that feeling.
So, Barry, what else do you do to create that immersion? I know we have more people looking straight at the camera in this movie than you normally find in a movie, including even the woman who accused him of raping her. Was that designed to sort of connect more directly with the audience?
It is, and it's something that we kind of stumbled onto in Moonlight, as James said, through this feeling that what was being captured by the camera wasn't as visceral, as immersive as what we were feeling on set. The first time we tried this was in Moonlight. If you guys saw it, the scene where Naomi Harris and Ashton Sanders, where they fight over the money. She approaches him in the courtyard. She says, "Where'd you go last night?" And we were filming that scene in the housing project that I grew up in. That's where Alpha McCraney grew up in. And this woman is basically playing a composite of both our moms. And it felt like it wasn't, the emotion I was feeling on set was not going to be the emotion that was being communicated to the audience. And so it felt like having you look directly at her, walk a mile in this character's shoes, that was going to be the most visceral way to accomplish it. And so going into this project, we made those choices fearfully in Moonlight, I'll say. Can people look directly into the camera? Can we have three dudes who don't look like each other play the main character? Those things, fearfully. And so I think with this film, we knew that we wanted to make these decisions confidently. We wanted to, have these actors look directly into the lens and knowing exactly what we were doing, which was to take passive empathy and make it active. Reading a book is a very active experience. You read a line of dialogue in a book, you hear it in your head. The author describes a smell with synesthesia. You intellectually reflect what that smells like in your head. Everything's activated. The movie is very passive. The screen is here, you guys are out there, somebody's chewing popcorn, you hear that. your cell phone lights up, the AC is too cold or too hot, all this shit. It's all designed to take you out of the film. However, every now and then, if you have to look someone directly into the eye, you kind of sit up. Kiki Layne described, who plays Tish in this film, was her first time acting in a film, and she described looking into the camera as being the most difficult thing that we asked her to do. And then I was like, oh, that's just because she's green. But then she explained it to me. She's like, no, Barry, I want you to hear me. She said, acting is giving and receiving. And when you're in a scene with a scene partner, you give, they receive, they give back. When you're acting directly into the camera, you give, and it goes nowhere until it's here. She gives, you receive, and then hopefully, because the emotion is reaching you, you give something back, either to us, to the screen, to your partner, to yourself, however. And this woman, Angela Flournoy, a great author, wrote a piece on myself in the film in the New York Times, and she talked about these direct-to-camera scenes, and she explained to me what this shit means, because we just do it off instinct, Like, the actors never know when we're going to do them. James and I rarely know when we're going to do them. The only one we knew we were going to do in this film was Regina King with the wig. The others spontaneously, Emily Rios, and you were talking about the woman Victoria Rogers. She was only on set for one day in the Dominican Republic, and at the end of her scene work, it felt like she had released something. And so I wanted to capture what it was she had released. And so I said, would you mind going up to this hilltop, and I just need you to look directly into the audience. And she said, Barry, I have no problem with that. And I knew that at some point, I wanted the audience to look this woman directly in the eye, because she is not the antagonist in this film. She's a victim like anyone else, and you have to empathize with her trauma directly. Again, passive empathy becomes active empathy. So, in the New York Times, this lady said, and it was so, I was like, damn, I should have thought of that first. She said, because these moments happen, it's not like the height of drama, it's not that people are screaming, people are basically engaging with one another and reflecting on it's like a state of repose. She said, if you are a white person sitting in the auditorium, or a non-black person, and you're looking Tish, or Fonnie, or Sharon, or Chiron, or Paula directly in the eye, it might be the first time you've ever looked a black person directly in the eye in a state of emotion thus. And when you do that, you can't deny, one, their humanity, or two, that the empathy that you have for them has to be activated and not be allowed to remain passive. If you are a person of color, a black person, whomever, you are now seeing your cousin, your brother, your sister, your aunt. Again, this passive empathy has been made active. I don't know that when we're doing them. It's certainly not the purpose. I'm not doing these shots so white people can look at my black characters directly in the eye. But I've sat in rooms. I've watched this film with audiences. And those last two shots of Tish and Fonnie, when she says Fonnie was once 22, I was 19, you understand what was lost. And if we're going to come and sit in an auditorium, then we need to understand what is being lost. And so that's why we do those shots. And I don't know, we'll keep doing them. We're doing this 10-hour adaptation of the Underground Railroad. That would be, it's heavy enough. Yeah. And it's going to be on a small screen. I don't know if these shots work as effectively, on a small screen, but yeah, we'll see. If the spirit moves us, right, brother?
Great spirit.
Didn't you borrow some technique from Errol Morris to help the actors on these?
Well, so, you want to talk about that?
I mean, go for you. Start. I'll
So James and I know each other forever, and back in the salad days, when we were both still in San Francisco, James was trying to get his union days as a loader. And so one day he worked on a commercial with Errol Morris, and Errol, Mr. Morris, I'll say, was doing his Interatron thing. And I think he must have loaded, he was shooting on film. He must have loaded.
It was crazy.
Like thousands of feet of footage.
35 mil film for 12 hours a day. It was crazy. But yeah, it was the first time I'd seen that machine at work, and I didn't know what it was until that point. And I don't remember how it happened, but bringing it into this conversation, how we use it on this film, was really interesting. I think you can speak obviously more towards how it affects the performance, but for me, it was a real wonderful tool to be able to sort of hopefully give the actors something to Kiki's point, to act off of a little bit. Because
they're looking at a screen.
Yes, apologize. Yeah, so basically the idea is that you understand the idea of a teleprompter. Imagine a teleprompter, instead of words coming down where you would read into the lens as a newscaster might, you're now looking at your other co-star across on the monitor across, because we're doing two of these cameras at the same time. One's on Stephan and one's on Kiki, and so they're able to sort of while looking into the lens still. It's not physically Stephan, or it's not physically Kiki, but it's an image of them that's live that they can react off of.
Yeah, and for me, it was about when James pitched the idea, because if James pitched it, I was like, yeah, I want the audience to know what it feels like to look at a lover through glass, which is what Tish says at the very beginning of the film. And they are looking directly at one another, technically, but not literally, and the artifice and yet the promise, visiting someone across glass in prison is inhumane in a certain way. It's like, how horrible do you think this person is that they can't be in the same physical space as their loved one? And these are people who haven't even been convicted of anything. And so I wanted to sort of find a way to emotionally replicate that feeling for the actors. And I wanted you guys, again, to have to take passive empathy and make it active. Not only 2 of the 4 prison visits involved in Terratron, but the 2 that do, they get to a certain thing that I think the others don't.
Well, you guys all worked on Moonlight. I'm wondering, the things you did on Moonlight that you weren't sure if they were going to work, how much of a boost of your confidence does it give you that the last time you did it, you won Best Picture?
It's funny, man. Winning Best Picture was cool. My memory of the film is definitely starts before the Oscars, and so I made up my mind on what I thought of the film before the award season started. And so I'll answer from that point of view. I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. And I went to film school with Joi and James. Nick, I feel like I went to film school with him, but he went to Harvard and we went to Florida State, so not the same thing. But I went to film school with these folks, and I think the way we made Moonlight, and for anybody who hates Moonlight, I made a stupid film. The way we made Moonlight was the same way that we started out making anything, which was, you can't make something knowing for a fact that you're not going to fail. You just can't, because then you're never going to be reaching, you're not going to be pushing, and at that point, it might as well just remain a damn screenplay, because what's the fucking point? Like, what is the point, So yeah, I mean, as far as giving us more confidence, because it won't, no, man. And thankfully, the way it won Best Picture was so crazy that I don't know how you take anything constructive away from that. So.
I'd also just say, too, like, I think with Barry, it seems as if we're always starting from scratch a bit. Like, with our first film, Medicine for Melancholy, it looks nothing like Moonlight. Looks nothing like Beale Street. Beale Street looks nothing like Moonlight. And none of it looks like Medicine for Melancholy. I think it's a hope that we apply ourselves in unique ways every time we get a new piece of material. And that's very much the goal. I think it would be strange if these things were, clearly we're in all those movies on some level. I don't mean to say they're that disparate, but there isn't an idea necessarily of building on something in many ways. I think it's always an idea of getting down to the core of something. And this film was about Tish, of course. But it's about digging deep into what the initial heart of the concepts are, and building from there each time. So for me, I feel like I was starting from scratch anyway, personally.
Well, this was written decades ago. It's set, I guess, mostly in the 70s, but it also feels like, you're aware that you're also talking about, the current political situation, the current racial situation. When you're making this, are you thinking of 2018 as much as 1970?
Yeah, it was hard not to. Our first day on set, the Harvey Weinstein story broke, and so it was just like, it was in the air. James Baldwin published this novel in 1974. I think he was just such he was so wise and just so aware of what was actually going on, what was really going on. And so he spoke the truth. And I think when you speak the truth, if the truth has not been addressed, if these issues have not been allayed, then it's always going to be relevant. And clearly we've seen in the last 18 months that so much that happens in this story just hasn't been properly addressed. And so we were aware that the story we were telling was very relevant. And for me, what it required was a really dense unpacking. A couple things happened on this film, man, because Moonlight is such the male point of view, and this movie is not the male point of view. I'm not a woman, James Baldwin's not a woman, and so I had to really check my directorial ego and really listen to Regina King and Kiki Layne and understand that there were places where my personal experience ended and the characters just superseded it, and I just couldn't make these choices on my own. And then we were really unpacking, listening to the women involved in the film, especially Joi and Post, and really trying to understand, how does this feel? And for me, I had to unpack what was actually happening in the story. So I gotta say, point of fact, Fonny is not falsely accused of anything. He's chosen out of a police lineup. He's placed in a police lineup by a racist police officer. And we see the moment when this racist police officer decides, I'm going to get you, because you did not look away when I looked at you. That is what's really happening. And in the book, it's even clearer. Fonny's the only black man in the police lineup. But I thought, that's too easy. That's just too easy. You should have to sit here and watch these things and really now do the unpacking that I had to do, taking this from page to screen. The other thing is, Stephan James, who plays Fonny, modeled his character on this young man named Khalif Browder, who was, there's a documentary about him you can watch right now. He was a young man who was arrested for the crime of stealing a backpack, and he was sent to Rikers Island, and he awaited trial for 3 damn years. Spent 2.5 of those 3 damn years awaiting trial, something he did not do, but solitary confinement. And when he was exonerated and released, because he refused to plead guilty, had he pled guilty, he may have done a year in Rikers, but he wouldn't have that on his record. He didn't plead. After 3 years, he was out, and he committed suicide because the trauma was so deeply within him. This happened within the last 5 years. Can you imagine being a young black man in 1974 and somebody who's within the system that's just so easily manipulated going, you? So I understood very clearly that what we were doing was so damn relevant, and the actors did as well. That's why someone like Brian Tyree Henry can show up for one day, but he knows it. He knows it.
So, Joi, did you see it as part of your job to sort of be the female voice?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the scenes that I really connected to was when Sharon Rivers, who's played by Regina King, comes in and talks to Kiki, who's played by, I just forgot her name. Oh, I called her Kiki. I'm sorry. I'm getting the names confused. Comes in and talks to Tish, who's played by Kiki Layne, and it's just a moment where, as a parent, you know, she doesn't have all the answers, and she's so upfront about that. But she's saying, you're not on your own. And that was a moment that I know Barry and I had discussed on whether it stays or whether it goes. And I just told him, like, from a female point of view, and having lost my mom when I was in college, it was just a moment of connection and a moment that was so real that I feel like a lot of audience members just might need that moment between a mother and daughter to really see where this, you know, how young this woman is and how much she's having to go through and how much the love and support from her family means to her.
But I'm going to piggyback that, because you told like the serious story. You tell a fun story. So the first time Tish and Fonny make love, right? They walk into the apartment. It's this long tracking shot. They go to the bed. They sit down. So James and I built this shot. It's like cinema, where the focus stays with Tish. She's sitting on the bed. He gets up. He walks away. This is not in the movie. He walks away. Focus stays with her. He's this blob. He's just going in the background. You don't see him play the record. You just stay with her. She's thinking. She's getting herself together. And then he slowly comes back, the blob. He walks himself back in focus, sits on the bed. Then they go down to 2-shot. All one shot. I was like, yo, this is dope, right? And then Joi said, Barry, what do you think you're doing? I was like, it's the female gaze, the female point of view. We stayed with her, and we didn't see him. And then Joi said, but Barry, Stephan is hot. if that was a hot girl going to the record player, taking off her pants, you would cut to her, wouldn't you? And so, James, being the smart man that he is, he had coverage. And so, because Joi is the editor, we cut to Stephan James with his 6-pack and his shoulders and everything. And so this is what happens when you have a woman helping you tell a woman's story. That's a true story.
I think I did that for everybody. It wasn't just for me.
Well, I think we have time for a couple questions from the audience right here.
Hi, I guess I'll talk loud. My name is Pierre. I'm an agent. I have a client, James. I would love you to meet him again, but that's another story. I was very interested in the choice that you made with the narration going through the film. Was that decided before, after? Was that part of the book? How was that choice made, Barry?
Question was about the narration going throughout the whole film. How's that choice made? It's James Baldwin, and so, you know, and this is the first English language feature film adaptation of James Baldwin, and so I wanted his voice to arrive intact. When I read Baldwin, the way he speaks, as James said earlier, that's what moves me the most. You know, the story's very simple, but I think the way in which it's told, I'm talking about the novel, not the film, is just so damn evocative. No one else can tell the story the way he does. So I knew I wanted the narration to be very prominent in the film, spoken through Tish. But then we're always trying to make this as immersive an experience as possible. I was saying earlier, when you read a novel, you know, the author describes a smell, you sort of put synesthesia smell in your head, and if a character that says something on the page, you hear it in your head. And so we want to treat this room like the inside of a head, a certain way. Like I'm always chasing literature when we make these movies. And so the dialogue in the film comes from the front. If the character on screen is speaking, that comes from the front of the room. The voiceover comes from every speaker in the room. So you're surrounded by Tish's voice, surrounded by these observations that Mr. Baldwin is making through her. And so we always knew from the very first draft of the script, it was in there. What I love about this process is there were times where, whether it was the score or the image or the juxtaposition, there was more score or more narration in the script than there was in the film, because we slowly, through this process, realized we don't need it here. You know, it's useful here. You know, the actors are saying everything that Mr. Baldwin is saying, and in one particular piece that Joi cut, Nina Simone is saying everything that Mr. Baldwin could ever say, and so we don't need voiceover there. So yeah, it was always going to be in it.
Yeah, I especially love the way you contrasted religion and spirituality in the film. And I was just wondering what in particular, was there a particular theme or a particular element that was drew you to this story?
That's a damn good question. I've done a lot of Q&A. I've done a lot of Q&As for this film, and I've not gotten that question yet. You know, there was Mr. Baldwin was known for having grown up in the church, and because of his sexuality in some ways, not being rejected by the church, but being rejected or persecuted in certain ways by individuals. And so I think religion in his work has always been a very delicate thing, and we have this character, Mrs. Hunt, who was present in the book and in the film, which was a very delicate thing. You know, myself and Anjanou Ellis, who plays Mrs. Hunt, we had to work out what that was, because I didn't want to change the actual text in creating that character. And so we let her arrive as she arrives on the page. And the things she says in the book are the things she says in the film. Anjanou and I, I'm going inside our head a little bit, you know, we kind of worked out why she was saying these things. In a certain way, Mrs. Hunt has done everything right, and yet this thing is still happening to her child. So whose fault is that? I've done everything right. I've lived by the word, and yet this thing still happens. And so I think the lashing out that's happening is not at Tish, it's not at religion, it's just at the situation. I did everything right. Now, when you make a film, it's so dope because, you know, Joy's mother and father were pastors, so again, I got my ride or die right here. I just helped me God too, because I'm not a very religious person, but the actors started doing things, you know, just, we did the scene with Brian Tyree Henry, and at the end of the day, it was like our last day of production in New York. The art department was so good, they went and got the best barbecue in Yonkers. And they just got just platters of it and brought it out. And so we just had like a barbecue. That scene when Nina Simone's playing, they're not acting, they're just sitting around eating ribs. Actually eating ribs. And this thing happened where I don't know why it came to me. I said, you know, I think y'all should say grace. And so Kiki reached over and grabbed Brian's hand, grabbed Stephan's hand, and they just prayed before they ate. And so now we're in Hollywood, we're in LA, so y'all probably caught this. I think the full credits rolled. It goes New York unit, Dominican Republic unit, and then it says LA unit? Like what? So the ending of the book is different than the ending of the film. We filmed the original ending of the book. What happens in the ending of the book is Stephan James's father, Michael Beach, who plays Frank, he commits suicide. Tish comes home from seeing Fonnie for the last time, and her parents walk in and says they found Frank. She goes, what you mean they found him? I've got to tell Fonnie. As she's rushing out the door, she goes into labor. The baby's born. The book ends. Now, when people saw the film originally, the last prison visit scene with Fonnie, people thought, because of Stephan's performance, that if you didn't see him again and you didn't, the baby's born, and that's it, the book ends. They thought he committed suicide. And so I thought, now I'm telling this story, because the book is the book, the film is the film, where the black father and the black grandfather have both committed suicide, and the baby is born into this world with no father. And so I thought, I can't do that. I just can't do that. And so we decided to add one additional day of production after about 4 or 5 months of editing. And Fonny says this thing, I'm going to build us a great big table, and our family's going to eat off of it for a long, long time to come. Not the table he promised, but it's the table he has. And I just wanted to show the family is there is love, the child is healthy, and they are going to eat. And someday he's going to get out, and everything's going to be cool. And I don't know why, because I didn't grow up in the church, but I felt like they had to pray. And so we had this child say grace. And so these things, none of those things are in the script. Every other time they pray is not in the script. It's just these things that happen organically. And so I don't think there's a tension between the religion and the spirituality. You didn't say that at all. But I think that going from page to screen was one of those things that, I don't know, it just manifested itself as, I think, the thesis of the novel.
Well, I would love to keep this going, but I'm getting the wrap-up signs. So I'll just say,
Come on, bro. You get the wrap-up sign at the wrap. Come on, bro. Come on,
no
bro.
pun intended. Barry Jenkins, Nicholas Britell, Joi McMillon,
Thank you.